Welcome to Class 5 for Hebrew Exegesis, BRITE Old Testament 506. Today we'll be completing our examination of how to do word studies on words in the Hebrew Bible, as well as looking at usages of the different tenses and aspects of the verb. So let's jump in. In last week's lesson, we mentioned three primary areas or contexts in which we need to examine the usage of a word in the Old Testament. The authorial context, how does the author use this word? The literary context, what is surrounding the word, how does the word get used in other places in the Old Testament, not written by the same author, and semantic context, which is where we're going to look today.
Semantics deals with the meaning of a word itself. Some have wished to make the argument that a word has no meaning apart from context. However, that's not entirely the case, as much as we emphasize context and say context is king, as we just talked in the last lecture about literary context and authorial context. However, a word unit itself will still have meaning, and part of the goal of semantics is to examine that meaning. And so one of the ways that we will examine that meaning is by looking at the history of the word, the way that the word has been used in the past up through particular text that we're looking at. What is the background of that particular word? We'll also look at the root of the word. This is sometimes called etymology, looking at the root to determine what the root tells us about the meaning of a particular word. Kavod is from the word kavad. Kavad means heavy, an adjective. So we have kavod, which is glory, heaviness, weightiness, social, reputational heaviness. And so we can get an idea of what it means to be glorious by considering the importance of that word, heavy. We also look at cognate languages. This is an opportunity to look at other languages such as Ethiopic, Syriac, Aramaic, perhaps even Akkadian or Ugaritic, and see the meaning of those roots and how it affects the meaning of our root in our language. For instance, we might understand that hademu is a footstool, but as we examine the use of that word in other cultures and in other places, we might find out that a hademu is where the king would keep a copy of the law, which gives us an idea perhaps then of what exactly is being implied about the Ark of the Covenant, where the book of the law is kept. Does mean that the Ark of the Covenant is still the throne of God. We're not dismissing the throne and saying it's only a footstool, but at least it gives us an idea of the cultural importance of the way that that word is used in cognate languages in other cultures. Unfortunately, semantics has been heavily abused in the last 100 years, mostly because scholars have forgotten completely about context. So rather than claiming that a word has no meaning apart from context, too many scholars have gone the other way and said that semantics is the end-all for a word's meaning. For instance, some scholars have bought so heavily into the idea of etymology and the root of a word that they have created absolutely ridiculous arguments. James Barr, in his book, The Semantics of Biblical Language, notes that the word bread, lechem, and the word war, malchama, have the same root, lamed he mem. Therefore, he says, if we were to use this root fallacy, we would have to say that bread and war are part of the same semantic domain. Obviously, that is not the case. Bread and war have absolutely nothing to do with each other, just like butterfly has nothing to do with butter. And so we need to be careful when we make an assumption based on etymology. Also, scholars have attempted to study the history of a word and then have taken everything from that word's history and assumed that it is present in a particular word. So that when you find a word in the prophets, you have to consider all the history from Genesis up through that prophet, and not only know the history of that word, but assume that the entire history of the word is present in the word in your particular context. This is sometimes called the illegitimate totality transfer, or the illegitimate identity transfer, taking all of the meaning of a particular root or a particular word and assuming that it is present in every instance of the word. And so rather than using shade of meaning to say a word may be shaded in this direction and mean this in a particular context, it's assumed that you can take everything and apply it to a particular word. One scholar has pointed out that davar means thing. It also means to speak or to say. And so if we were to use this illegitimate transfer, we would say that throughout history, the word devar has been used to mean thing, but since it also means word, we can say that everything of Yahweh is actually a revelation of Yahweh, when that's not the case. It's just simply a thing, a catch-all term. Actually, Deber can mean pestilence. So does that mean that every time God speaks, he's sending a pestilence upon the world? No, of course not. But that's what happens if we emphasize too much the history of a word. Diachronic criticism, it's sometimes called, looking through time and applying it to a synchronic, one time in time, and trying to make the argument there. The other danger of cognate languages is that at times we can find something in a particular culture, a particular language, and apply it improperly to Hebrew when the Hebrews may not have that particular conception, that particular idea of what lies behind that particular word. For instance, shalom and salam both mean peace, but the Hebrew concept of shalom is so much deeper and so much larger than simply the word salam, meaning peace. And so we need to be careful as we transfer from one culture to another. Just because a word has a particular meaning in a particular culture doesn't mean it has that meaning in every culture. Part of this is really what sometimes is called the lexical conceptual equation, that there is a concept that is permanently connected to a lexical or semantic term. And that is a fallacy. Words have context. Words are used in different places to mean different things, different shades of meaning. And that concept is not permanently connected to that particular word. From one culture to another, from one time to another, from one author to another. And so we need to be careful that we don't abuse our study of semantics. That doesn't mean that we dismiss semantics altogether because of these fallacies and abuses. It just means that we progress cautiously in our use of them. It can still be helpful to look at the history of a word and to see how a particular author in previous eras used a particular word and how that may nuance the usage of our word. Perhaps the author is drawing upon what we know about the history of that word. It's possible that the author is emphasizing the etymology of a particular root. For instance, in 1 Samuel 4, there is a joke about the glory of God departing, Ichabod, but also the fact that Eli is a heavy man, kavod. There is, however, no discussion about Eli's liver, which is the same root, kaf bet daled, kaved. So the author is not trying to make a joke based on the root of kaved, liver, and kavod, glorious, as if to suggest that Eli's liver is glorious. Instead, we're talking about the heaviness, the weightiness of God versus the literal heaviness of Eli, who perhaps is heavy because he ate all the sacrifices that were supposed to be for the glory of Israel, for Yahweh. And so we have here a play on words using those particular roots. So the etymology in that instance is greatly important, but not always. So we need to be careful. The same with cognate languages. We could use the cognates to look at a particular root used in another culture, and it may actually give us some information. We've already talked about the use of the footstool, and we've talked about salam and shalom. Again, a caution of we can use cognate languages to shed light on a particular word, to nuance a particular word, to help us understand a word we may not know. We just can't push it too far. And so the warning of semantics is that as important as semantics is, we can't overemphasize semantics to the point of being illogical and introducing these fallacies into our biblical interpretation.
Let's look now at an example of semantic context in the examination of the root of a word from 1 Samuel chapter 9, verse 9. This is the story of where Saul and his servant are looking for the lost donkeys, and they say, let's go visit Samuel. However, we're given a little note that tells us that the Navi was in those days called a roeh. The question, though, is, does roeh mean prophet? A Navi is a prophet. Does that mean that a roeh is a prophet? After all, almost every instance of roeh in the Old Testament is used interchangeably with Navi. However, when we look at the root of roeh, we realize that the root is ra'ah, and that roeh is actually a participle of ra'ah, ra'ah meaning to see. And so we realize that roe is the seer, or literally the seer, the one who sees. So this is emphasizing a particular part of the job of a prophet, to be able to see into the future. And here we have Samuel doing that as he anoints Saul as king and tells him what happened to the donkeys, and also tells Saul what's going to happen on his way home, all of which comes true because the seer, was able to see the future and was able to understand what was taking place. He saw the future, he saw visions, he saw God meeting with him in some instances, or the angel of the Lord in others. And so we understand an even deeper level of what it means that somebody is a roeh, because we grasp that it comes from the root of ra'ah. It's not just a prophet, but it's emphasizing a particular part of being a prophet, that is, seeing visions. Examining the roots can be extremely helpful when we have words that only occur a few times. For instance, last week in our lecture we looked at Genesis 1:2, marachephet, the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters, and we realized that marachephet only occurs once in the entire Old Testament. However, the root rahaf also occurs in Deuteronomy chapter 32 in reference to an eagle, yarachef. So we were able to understand that marachephet has to do with hovering, similar to hovering like an eagle, hovering protectively over the waters or preparing to guide and to do something, just as the eagle in Deuteronomy is used to describe God guiding the people in the wilderness and protecting them like an eagle protects its young. So we're able to use the root of marachephet in order to examine other instances of this word in the Old Testament. As we're examining the cognate roots of the word within Semitic context, we need to differentiate between textual criticism and cognate studies. In cognate studies, examining the Peshitta or the Septuagint will probably not be helpful in telling us the historical understanding of a particular Semitic root, because while Syriac comes from Aramaic, which is a Semitic language, it's very late, further on in history than Hebrew, and the Septuagint is in Greek, which is not a Semitic language. Textual criticism uses both the Peshitta and the Septuagint in order to show us what the correct word is in terms of looking at the translation in both of those and trying to reverse engineer what the Hebrew word is they were examining. But it's not actually looking at the root of the Hebrew word as we do in cognate studies. But even then, both those documents can be helpful as we examine them, because they may tell us the understanding of both the Septuagint and the Peshitta, how they understood the connotation of a particular word. But usually this is not as helpful as it may seem, because the Septuagint and the Peshitta are simply taking a Hebrew word and translating it into their respective language. So only in particular situations will the actual translation be helpful in telling us how they understood it. More often, when we're talking about cognate studies, we're looking at words that are closer, that have propinquity. That is, that they are closer to Hebrew, either in the history of the language or in the geography of the ancient Near East. So we're talking about languages like Hittite and Ugaritic, Arabic, even Proto-Semitic, which comes long before any of these languages. Even to some degree, Egyptian and hieroglyphics, as we're understanding the influence that those languages may have had upon Israel. As we're looking at these words, we may realize things like differentiations between Canaanite and non-Canaanite languages. For instance, in Hebrew, shalom means peace. In Arabic, it's salam. And we know from Ugaritic and other languages that Canaanite languages, which Ugaritic is not, but we know that Canaanite languages had a tendency to make a long A into an O, what we often call the Canaanite shift. And so by comparing Hebrew to these other languages, we're able to see the differences, but also to see the influence that these other languages may have had upon our word. We do need to be careful, though. Just because words share the basic root from language to language doesn't mean that they share influence. They may have actually grown apart over time, or we may simply be looking at words that had a common ancestor but now no longer do. And so we need to be very careful about how exactly we go about our cognate studies. Let me give just two quick examples of where cognate roots can be helpful. In Proverbs 26:23, we read, Kesef sigim. The question is, though, does this mean silver dross? Kesef means silver. Sig means dross in Hebrew. However, our cognates from Ugaritic tells us that actually the kaf is a preposition, as, and the samek, the pei, the samek, and the gimel are actually a four-letter root from Ugaritic that means glaze. So these are like glazed, which makes a whole lot more sense than silver dross, because he's talking about something fake that's going on top of a particular piece of earthenware, just as lies and such can be fake. And so this particular use of the cognate is very helpful in understanding what exactly the writer is saying. The same is true in Psalm chapter 1. In Psalm 1 we read, Ashrei Ha'ish, which we often translate as happy is, or oh, the happiness and the blessedness. However, Ashrei potentially comes from an Akkadian root that has to do with striding. So this man is blessed because his striding, his path is blessed. And so we have a better understanding of what exactly the psalmist intended based upon an Akkadian cognate of the same word. So this is the value of cognates, being able to compare one language to the other and get an understanding of the nuance or perhaps the shared history of particular words. So where exactly do we find the roots? Well, again, we have to look in our lexicons and our Hebrew dictionaries. Understanding that Brown Driver Briggs is somewhat out of date and the cognate information emphasizes Arabic. Instead, we probably need to look at the Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, because that is a far more recent lexicon and has much better understanding of the cognates of other languages. But we also need to look in commentaries and journals and word books, because these will also shed light upon our particular root, as commentators and scholars debate where a particular word may have come from. In the end, though, we need to not only gather the data, we then need to compare the data. Just because we found the word in another language, we need to think critically about the use of that word. For instance, in both Arabic and Hebrew, we have kesem, and in Arabic and Hebrew, we have lechem. But in Arabic, kesem means part, whereas in Hebrew, it has to do with divination or looking to see the future. Some lexicons even say magic. In Arabic, lechem means meat. In Hebrew, it means bread. And yet neither of those are actually connected to one another based upon what they actually denote, and yet they reveal the fact that they probably have a common ancestor having to do with food, lechem. Kesem, how we put part and divination together, is a mystery, and so these two are probably not true cognates. And so we need to be careful as we're examining these words to make sure, once again, that we're examining our research critically, making sure that it's helpful and not actually leading us down a false path towards false cognates. Just because the words sound the same or appear to have the same roots doesn't mean they're actually connected. But where they are connected and where we've confirmed it with lexicons and dictionaries and journals, we're able to use that information to better understand our particular word within the Hebrew text. Once we have thoroughly examined the semantic context of a word, we're ready to put that information back into our overall word study, combining it with authorial context and literary context. Our author most likely knew the semantic context of a word when he chose it. However, sometimes authors will choose a particular word ironically because of its semantic context, using the word in a different way or even in a comedic sort of way to emphasize a particular point. We also understand that semantic context has to do with denotation. How is the word typically understood within a dictionary as we would define it, as we're examining all the different inputs from various languages to give us an understanding of our particular word? How is this word then used within its literary context as we examine its connotation? How those other surrounding words change or nuance the particular information that we're looking at. So once we have accomplished our research, examining it in all of these parts, examining it in lexicons and commentaries and word books as necessary, we're able to come to a conclusion, either agreeing with the lexicon's decision or perhaps adding just a little bit of nuance based upon our examination.
As we examine a word in its semantic context and then place it back into a particular passage, we need to remember the goal is not necessarily simply to define a word. The goal is to discover what the author is trying to communicate to us through that word. So we need to include background information, historical context, and so on and so forth, as well as the authorial context and the literary context. What is it that the author wishes us to understand in his or her usage of this word? We're really dealing with the concept, and some have even called this conceptual semantics or conceptual linguistics, trying to understand what is the concept, what is the idea that is trying to be communicated by the author. And so semantic context, the definition of a word, is part of that, but we put it back into its context because we're trying to see what the author meant. Why did the author use this particular word in this particular context? What meaning were they trying to get across?
I'd like to shift gears a little bit and look at some Hebrew grammar, specifically verbs. We've looked at the perfect and the imperfect in elementary Hebrew, talking about the aspect of incomplete and completed action or tense, past, present, future, but there are other usages of both of these in the Old Testament. For instance, the perfect, the katal, can be used for the prophetic future, something that's in the future but is so guaranteed that it's spoken of as though it's already been completed. So that we read in Isaiah 9:1, the people walking in darkness have seen a great light, and yet we understand that what is meant is they will see a great light. Lamentations 1:21 is also similar in that there is an optative use, or a wish, a desire, talking about the nation saying, they have heard, they have rejoiced, and then because of that, so you will do and you will bring. But these you will do and you will bring is really a prayer on behalf of the lamenter who's praying that God would indeed do these things. And the verse finishes with his declaration that they, the nations, will be just as I am. And so this is clearly a future. It doesn't exist yet, but he wishes that it would. So he uses a perfect form. These are just two examples of a handful of examples in the Old Testament where the typical aspect or tense of the perfect that we would expect is not quite the usage. So we need to be careful as we're translating that we don't woodenly translate everything we come across, but instead examine it within its context to see what other usages of the verb may be in question. The yiktol form, the imperfect, is also used in some unusual ways. For instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 12, the imperfect is actually used to reference the past. Yerashum, they seized them, talking about taking the land from the Horites on behalf of the Edomites, seizing Mount Seir. This is a historical past, and so it talks about what was being done or what was accomplished, and yet it's still a usage of the imperfect to designate the past. The same is true of the preposition before, terem. It is always followed by the yiktol imperfect, such as Genesis 2:5, before any bush was on the earth. There's also an aspect of the imperfect that references ongoing action, such as Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 44, that talks about what bees do. They don't just do it once, but they continue to do it. And so while we might expect a perfect form of just this is what bees do, that iterative, durative, ongoing process indicates that we need an imperfect verb here to give that nuance. The imperfect can also be used to indicate repeated, non-ongoing action, such as Genesis 37:15, where Joseph looked several times, looking in different places for his brothers. What are you looking for? Ma tabakash. As somebody asks him, what are you looking for? He's looking for his brothers, repeatedly, in different cities. We also have instances where something is repeated or is ongoing in the past, and yet we still use the imperfect, such as Genesis 2:6, where a mist was going up from the earth. It went up every day to water the earth, apparently, in the early morning hours of each day, and so we use an imperfect here to indicate that it was ongoing. It didn't stop, it kept doing this, but it was a past event. And sometimes, as in Genesis 42, verse 37, we use the imperfect to indicate permission, where Reuben, in a insert foot into mouth sort of situation, says that if he doesn't bring Benjamin back safely, Jacob has permission to kill each of Reuben's two sons. Again, permission here is indicated by tamit, the imperfect, you may kill. Two final usages to highlight here of the yiktol imperfect. In Leviticus 19:32, the word is used almost volatively, almost as an imperative. In the presence of gray hair, you must rise. And in 2 Samuel 15:4, Absalom uses the imperfect as a wish or a desire. literally saying, who will appoint me as a judge in the land? But he's really saying, oh, that I were. Oh, I wish somebody would do this, looking to the future. So again, as we're examining the particular aspect or tenses of the katal and the yiktol, the perfect and the imperfect, we need to make sure that we're capturing the nuance of the particular word in the context of the verse. Our lecture today was not particularly long, but it was quite technical, so make sure you go back through and examine anything that you don't quite understand. Watch this video as many times as necessary. Be working on your word study that'll be due in a week. Also be checking on your vocab and studying that, and I will see you in class.